Hey everybody, happy Monday. I hope you had a good weekend. I wanted to, I'm going to start this new thing where I do a little elaboration recording. Probably it'll happen on Mondays because the time works best for me. But things that I can't get to during the class, I'm going to record a little video so that I can talk about this, uh, expand on the idea just a little bit because we've run out of time during the class. All right, so this week we're talking about the rule of odds, which is obviously kind of a silly rule. And I'd mentioned in class Wednesday this idea of what I call symmetri-phobia, where everybody is so scared. Teachers will tell you often, and it almost seems like it's more of a photography rule, but I've heard art teachers say it too. Don't use even number of objects in your still life. And so we talked about on Wednesday some of the possible approaches, so I thought I'd elaborate a little bit. And in fact, I'm going to do a quick demo on the hardest one, this third one that's coming up. So, approach number one is just do it, own it. And I think this is an overarching principle in art anyway that people miss. If you are very intentional about what you're trying to do, people tend not to question it. And so if for example, center, like when you're breaking a rule, if it's centering or if it is using even number of objects, if it's flattening form, any of that sort of stuff, when you are kind of selling it or when you're really committed to the idea, or as I say here, you're owning it, uh, people rarely, I mean, it's sometimes other art students will call you out, but, you know, is it necessary to keep all the art students happy? I think when you are very direct and very clear in your intention, people tend to get that. And in fact, oftentimes that's the secret, the overarching secret to breaking a rule is you do it very clearly and intentionally, and then people kind of think like, oh, well, they must know what they're doing, so they do it so intentionally, maybe they're right. So that was the first one. The second one would be grouping things together. So this is the one that I'm going to elaborate on a little bit because there's a little bit more kind of technical information in here. I'm going to do a quick digital drawing of this in a moment. The third one would be variation, where you modify one of the objects. Either you change its color, you change the amount of light on it, possibly you just move it. Even just tipping this pair over has kind of taken care of that. And then the fourth one, which is really the fourth one's kind of the best of all possible worlds, so to speak. Rarely will somebody see something like this and think, oh, why did they use two objects? Because there's so much going on otherwise that is asymmetrical or that's dynamically symmetrical, I suppose. In a sense, in this photo, the blue towel and the or cloth and the gray cloth are kind of offset by the really bright red cloth to the left of the left pair and the highlight on the pair. And so it's symmetrical in a sense, but it's not like dead symmetrical. It's not so geometric that it gets boring. So what I want to do is show you sort of this approach, or at least how I would suggest thinking about this. Here I have the image and I have a little fake canvas, little digital canvas. Here's how the idea works. When you are grouping, probably a lot of you are very familiar with this idea. Rather than, I'm kind of drawing the pair to the left. Rather than isolate one pair and then isolate the other pair, try thinking of it instead like this whole pair mass is one big thing. And so as you make your decisions, so here I'll just color it in for this is nice too because it keeps you painting loose. It's a very easy way to paint outside the lines, so to speak. So rather than separate those two objects, I'm going to join them together. And you could also get away with this if you are uh, you have multiple different types of objects that you're trying to pull together, but it's really easy to demonstrate like this with these objects. They're essentially the same. And so now here's where the secret part comes in. The next few steps you make, you want to augment and exaggerate the sameness of the two objects. So it's easy to think, oh well, there's a pair here. I mean, there's two pairs, so I'm going to make a separation between those two pairs. And as soon as you've done that, you've kind of missed the mark on this approach, or you're definitely not using it the way that I'm suggesting. So what you want to do is ask yourself what commonalities are there. And so what we have here, the shadow side of the left pair comes across and casts itself onto the second pair. So you see this whole shadow shape now is kind of one big mass. And so I've kind of joined together these two, what we would think were two objects, but in the painting, I'm pulling them together using this shadow. And so I want to find any other possibility where that happens. And in fact, this kind of reaches up here. They have a unity of like the table, and actually the background really helps us out here too. So as this comes across, I kind of want, so I'm going to try this old Dutch trick, or this old, might even be kind of a Spanish Baroque trick. Fill in this table here, where I can make the table itself also part of the pairs. So right now, in essence, we kind of, you could say we have two objects. We have a kind of pair mass, and we have a ground plane, so to speak, or a table. And so if I pull this up and in here, and if I grab maybe even some of the brown and pull it back down, there's going to be, the photo doesn't really show it, but there would be a reflection in this space, and there's another one right here. As much as I can kind of, I've heard people refer to this as cross-pollinating, as much as I can cross-pollinate these shapes, the more I can do that, the more, maybe we'll even get like an in-between value. The more I can do that, the more these things are all going to wrap together and seem less and less like two objects versus the ground. In fact, let me get the background kind of moving too. And so this is also a big unifying piece. Here's a bonus lesson right here. When you are rendering, when you're painting, I don't mean that to sound like illustrative, when you're laying in, let's use that term, laying in objects that are round, uh, consider all of the edges being squared off first. You see how all of my little pear bits, the edges are very harsh, kind of linear, as opposed to uh, coming right out the gate and kind of like rounding everything off. That always happens if you're particularly in oil paint. The rounding off, I'm working on the right side of the right pair right now. I call that art by committee. You slowly knock all the edges off, and it's not bad because I started with such a direct, linear kind of straight line start the sketch. But cool stuff starts to happen, like what's going on right there. And I mean that in a painting, not just in a digital drawing that I'm doing here. And so anytime you can do that sort of stuff, even with our kind of joined shadow mass, because as you work, if you're like me and if you're like a lot of people, as you work, you tend to knock those corners off anyway. So it probably doesn't hurt to uh, start off with something kind of loose, direct, aggressive, however you want to say that. And so here now I've got, I'm kind of re-establishing that there are two different objects. So I need to scramble a little bit to try to get them back into the world of being one. And so what I'm going to do, take this, this space here, the right bottom of the right pair is very bright. And that's kind of augmenting and telling us that these are separate. So if I drop that value a bit, it does a couple things. It creates some variety between the two. I mean, right, what would be called the two. It creates a little bit of variety so that they're not quite so much the same, and it melds them together a little bit more. And so the same idea, I want something like that over here on the left pair so that they kind of have something in common. So I'm looking for exaggerations of commonality. I really want to feature that so that these feel like one object instead of two. And again, let me just say for a moment that it's certainly okay on this approach to own it. If those things are very separate, but just be really deliberate if you're going to do it that way. But this way is the one that I think most people would kind of like this compromise a bit more. So I'm going to sort of feature, it's not a good color. I'm going to kind of feature the left part of our mass, of our pair mass. And the right part, I'm going to quiet down as much as possible. So you see there's also two kind of matching uh, highlights on the pairs. I'm going to use the left one a little more aggressively. It's going to take me a minute to sort of form this out. So a little more aggressive on the left one. If I put that aggressive value, that highlight over here on the right, now I'm just reinforcing, particularly if I do something like that, now I'm reinforcing the two pairness, the separation between them. And I don't want to do that. I want, at least for this, my intent on this image is to join them together. So I want to be as subtle as possible. There still probably needs to be some kind of highlight or something over here on the right just to make it feel representational. Not that you have to do that, by the way. Doing this abstractly is perfectly fine. This is probably a little more representational approach than I would even do if I was doing this as a painting. But you see how if I just sort of create a little bit of variety between those two pieces, play down their separateness. I forgot let's put a stem. And same thing even with the stems. If I feature the the left side stem a little more clearly and aggressively, and then the right side stem is a little bit more kind of washed out. Let's even do, speaking of washed out, another technique for this. This is where you do some of those lost edges. So you guys who are familiar, maybe I don't want the edge of this right pair to be quite so strict, because that also kind of blends it into the background. It kind of deprioritizes the one on the right. So you can see if you compare, and this isn't like very refined yet, but it at least gets the idea across. If you compare the little digital drawing with the photograph, you can see that there's definitely a difference. There's a separation between I'm sorry, how can I say this a little bit more clearly? There's the two of them feel a lot more joined together in the one on the right, of course, than the one on the left. And then if you just can't stand it, if you just cannot tolerate this joining, if it just doesn't look quote realistic enough to you, then you can kind of sprinkle in little hints that these things are separate. But you want to work in this direction rather than starting with two pairs that are drawn separately and outlined and then working your way toward trying to pull them together. I like this approach much better, where you mass it first and then you can mess with the there's some so the photograph, the camera has done a little bit of over distorting of the values, so it looks a little funky. It looks a little too dark in the darks, something that I would need to adjust for in a painting. But this is the idea, is that you start by exaggerating those similarities, and then we need a big highlight right here, and then you can sort of move towards separation. That highlight's pretty aggressive. Let me back it off. Then you can move toward that separation slowly, and you can work back and forth. So here I kind of feel like I want to join them together a little bit more. But that's the idea, is to think of this as this is actually also very good just general painting advice. When you mass, that's what that's called, or at least that's what I call it. When you mass objects together that maybe are not the same object. So let's say we even had an apple in here, or a plate. When you can, that didn't work. When you can create a mass out of multiple objects, it tends to just bind the painting together a little better. It tends to give you a little degree of abstraction. It makes the viewer's job a little more enjoyable, I think. It's a little smoother ride. I need to drive me crazy, this piece over here. It's a little smoother ride for the viewer's eye, so to speak, that you have organized it for them ahead of time. And so, I could develop this further and further, but for the sake of this elaboration for this week, that is the idea. So good luck, everyone. We'll see you on Wednesday. Excited to see that so far. Great stuff in the submissions, and excited to see what else you guys come up with. We'll see you Wednesday.